All right, hi everyone. Can you all see and hear me okay? Excellent. So let's share the screen and get back on track. So first thing we've got to do today is finish our look at Descartes' skepticism, and then we're going to move on to David Hume. So this is about where we left off. We had just sort of finished talking about the demon argument, um, and we discussed how Descartes arrives at this sort of epistemological foundation where he's constructed himself these two very powerful skeptical arguments, the dream argument and the demon argument. The first designed at aiming, uh, or the first is aimed at knowledge from the senses, right? And the point of the dream argument, just by way of recap, is that we can't trust the senses because the senses might not reveal reality as it is. Um, the demon argument is aimed at a priori knowledge, rational truths, we could call them, right? It's possible that some evil genius could deceive you about um, the number of sides triangles have, for example. Um, but even if that's the case, Descartes can know one thing with certainty, and that is whenever he is thinking, he can be certain that he exists. So, remember also, we discussed last time that Descartes sort of the thing that he wants is infallibility, right? If to say that he can know something with certainty, that proposition has to be infallible, not just indubitable or incorrigible, right? So Crumley at this point asks whether infallibility is actually necessary and sufficient for knowledge. Like, does a proposition have to be infallible um, for it to rise to the epistemic standards we want for knowledge? First, a note on this idea of necessity and sufficiency. This is something we see quite a lot of in philosophy, especially in the analytic tradition. Does anyone know a little about necessity and sufficiency? Maybe they want to tell us about it. Well, put it this way. Um, what's a good example? How about a banana? What is it to be a banana? Well, at least one thing that's necessary if your possible banana object is going to count as a banana is that it is a fruit. I guess bananas can also be sad. They're often yellow, but not always, right? Sure, but we're not talking about necessity and sufficiency with respect to people, right? Like for something to be a banana, it's necessary that it is a fruit because bananas aren't vegetables, right? Yeah, that's right. It has to be a fruit. So necessity is what is necessarily required for something to count as such. And in the case of the banana, it's necessary to be a fruit, to be a banana. If we're not dealing with a fruit, we can be pretty certain that we're not dealing with a banana, right? What about sufficiency? Well, sufficiency says that, um, again, in the case of the banana, let's see. Well, let's change gears. Um, so knowing that Elizabeth II was the queen, is sufficient for me to conclude that she's a woman. You see the idea there? And so the idea is when it comes to knowledge, um, no proposition will count as knowledge on this infallibility approach unless it is infallible. If something's going to count as knowledge, it has to be like a proposition has to be infallible to count as knowledge. That's the necessity part. And if you have an infallible proposition, then that is sufficient for it to count as knowledge. That's the sufficiency part. Everybody's becoming animals in the chat. That's pretty cool. Um, where does Descartes get this idea from? Well, he actually borrows it from Catholicism, right? Descartes, remember, is was educated at a Jesuit college, right? Um, but this idea of infallibility, Crumley notes, had come into question a little bit before Descartes arrived on the scene, right? One of the 95 Theses of Martin Luther, for example, was questioning papal infallibility, right? The infallibility of the popes, the infallibility of the pope, as well as the infallibility of Scripture. But this idea had started to come into question. Um, and Crumley says that if you're a skeptic in the Cartesian sense, you're probably right that infallibility is sufficient for knowledge. So if you have an infallible proposition, a proposition that cannot be wrong, not that cannot be shown to be wrong, that's incorrigibility, but a proposition that cannot be wrong, that is sufficient for knowledge. Whether infallibility is necessary is a different story. In fact, the fallibilists would say that we can have knowledge even if it's possible that we're mistaken. So if you're like a Cartesian infallibilist, infallibility is necessary and sufficient. But a fallibilist says it's sufficient, but it might not be necessary. So we could say that even if the possibility remains that we're mistaken about the truth of some proposition, um, even if there is that possibility, um, it might still count as knowledge, right? Our epistemic standards, according to the fallibilist, only need to rule out relevant alternative scenarios, not every possible scenario. I mean, like scenarios other than what we believe is the case, right? So, what are some examples? Could we come up with some examples of something that a fallibilist would say counts as knowledge? I'll try and come up with one. Oh, there's a few in the chat. Let's see what people are in the chat are saying. Yeah, okay. So the sun won't come up tomorrow is a good one. Science, question mark. Yeah, I would say science. Science is probably the best example because, um, I mean, we overturn um, scientific discoveries all the time, right? Um, Mine was a little more mundane. I was going to say, let's say that I go to the grocery store, and in the grocery store there are bananas. And then you ask me, do they have bananas at the grocery store? I say, yes, I was just there. I know they have some bananas. Um, but unbeknownst to me, in the meantime, somebody has come in and purchased all of the bananas. So now there are no more bananas. That's an alternative scenario um, that my epistemic standards, well, that's a scenario that maybe there's some wiggle room, right? But science is probably the better example. Because we say that we know things all the time. Often we find that even if we're not wrong in the sciences, we still only have a sort of incomplete picture, and we learn more than we thought we knew previously, right? So, and maybe skeptics, like the skeptic wants to rule out every possible scenario. Like it's possible that someone came and purchased all of the bananas from the grocery store. Okay, it's possible that the grocery store disappeared into a black hole, along with all of the bananas. Um, do I have to rule out that scenario to say that, like, I was just at the store. They've got bananas. Okay, maybe somebody could have bought all the bananas. Maybe the grocery store just up and went into a black hole. I don't need to rule that out, that possibility out, to say um, that I know that there are bananas at the grocery store, right? That's what a fallibilist says. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Um, Feldman here is a fallibilist, and he outlines a position where we can come to know things. We can arrive at true beliefs based on, having good reasons and by using reliable methods of attaining the truth, right? He says, and this is quoted in your textbook on page 14. Our experiences provide us with a very good evidence, but not absolutely conclusive evidence for propositions that we really do see a book and thus are not dreaming. So, for example, if I was looking at a book, right, I could be dreaming, but no, I mean, it's probably the case that I'm looking at a real book and that I'm awake and perceiving the world normally. This evidence is good enough to justify our ordinary skepticism and thus to satisfy the justification conditions for knowledge. All the arguments for skepticism rely on the mistaken assumption that justification and thus knowledge require conclusive evidence. So, what Feldman is saying here is we don't really need things that are definitively conclusive. We don't need definitively conclusive evidence in order to, um, say, okay, yes, I believe this proposition. I think this proposition is true. We need evidence that is good enough, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough. There are also lots of counter arguments against skepticism we could offer, right? Skeptics will often say, for example, that there might be many different propositions, evidence for rival propositions, um, and and that maybe we can't decide or cannot rule out one of those alternative scenarios. But here's the thing. Oh, that's a good question. Naturally, people are fallibilists even if they don't know it. Well, I wouldn't say that. Uh, I think so. Like we all have kind of like intuitions about certain things, even if we aren't necessarily aware of them, right? We often have intuitions about some matter or another, and by intuition, I mean that we make these sort of quick, unconscious judgments about things. That's what I mean by intuition, right? And I think intuitively speaking, some people are perhaps more skeptical and some are less skeptical. So some people might be fallibilists, and some people might intuitively lean towards skepticism, right? So there might be evidence for many different rival explanations, none of which we can know to be true because there are many different ways. There are many different ways to explain our common sense experiences of the world. Like I look across the way here and I see bicycles and trees and buildings and so forth. Um, but couldn't I just be a brain in a vat, right? But then the reply, um, would that not point to everyone being naturalists? Not necessarily. I think most people actually aren't naturalists. Nature versus nurture. I mean, who knows? Um, who knows the reasons why some people are perhaps more more skeptical versus more fallibilist, right? It's probably a combination, I would think, of environment and genetics. So a combination of nature and nurture. Nicholas, go ahead, please.
The counter argument to skepticism that you're detailing in the second half of this slide reminds me a lot of Occam's razor. Is that roughly accurate?
It's related, I would say. So Occam's razor, which we will learn about later in the course, is usually discussed in terms. So Occam's razor is like the principle of parsimony, and what it says. There are a few different formulations, but one explanation is that the simplest answer is most likely the correct answer. The second formulation is that one ought not to multiply necessity entities beyond necessity. Um, you want as few assumptions as possible. And that's a tool we use in the sciences. And what scientists are doing are different sorts of inductive reasoning, right? And that's what this counter argument turns on is a sort of induction, maybe. Um, so the counter argument that I'm getting to is that there might be all of these rival explanations that we have a hard time deciding between, but one of them is going to be better than the other ones. Maybe because of Occam's razor, maybe it's simpler and has the fewest assumptions, right? Maybe it explains the evidence in the most consistent way. So argument to the best explanation is often called abduction. It's a type of induction that some philosophers call abduction. Um, yeah, if you're a skeptic, well, a lot of scientific skeptics are naturalists. And naturalists, by the way, believe that all there is, well, if you're a metaphysical naturalist, you believe that the only things that exist are natural things. And that's probably going to be physical things. In other words, things that are studied by physicists. So matter, energy, um, force fields, gravitational fields, those things, right? But there's also methodological naturalism, and methodological naturalism says, well, there may be non-naturalistic things like uh, like ghosts or um, various gods or something. And they might be real, but science just can't really tell us anything about them, right? Yeah, David Hume, a skeptic, linked with inductive reasoning. He was quite concerned with how we use induction, actually. Um, a naturalist, it's not about reality being the only thing that's certain. It's that the reality is only just what is natural, what occurs in nature, nothing supernatural. So there could be a best explanation. Maybe we do some abduction, right? Um, maybe a skeptic says there's just as much evidence for our common sense view of the world, like namely that I am, this thinking being who is perceiving the world more or less the way it is, as there is for the proposition that we live in a simulation, right? Maybe those bicycles I see off the across the way. I think, oh, there's some sunlight reflecting off of those bicycles, which reaches my eyes and stimulates photoreceptors in my retina, which causes me to have a visual experience of the bicycles. The bicycles out there in the world cause my experience of the bicycles. There's just as much evidence for that, the skeptic would say, as there is for the proposition that we're all living in a big simulation like the Matrix. And you could say to the skeptic, all right, Mr. Skeptic or Miss Skeptic, um, but it's still the best explanation that we live in the real world. And you can appeal to some line of abductive reasoning. You could appeal to Occam's razor, right? But the bottom line is like, okay, sure, maybe I don't have any more evidence for the proposition that I live in the real world than for the proposition that I live in the Matrix or something. But all things being equal, the best explanation is still that I live in the real world. So we would say that the best explanation is the one that's most likely to be true. Therefore, as a fallibilist, I can remain safe in the knowledge that I don't live in the Matrix, right? So this is interesting, and a lot of people are kind of like, "Wait, why are we even considering this possibility?" Well, um, once again, the reason why we're doing this is because we're doing philosophy, right? We're asking fundamental questions about all kinds of things. And in this case, we're asking fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, right? So it's important in that regard. Also, there are people um, who take the prospect of living in a simulation seriously, right? Anybody know who I'm talking about here?
Elon Musk.
Yeah, he's kind of an eccentric fellow. And he seems to really entertain the possibility. Oh, to Andrew, ugh, ugh. Let's just say the less said about him, the better. But yeah, both of these people are annoying. Yes, bad. And they're both kind of responsible for appropriating or maybe not appropriating but getting in on the appropriation of the red pill idea, right? Like from the Matrix. So I know we've seen the Matrix, right? We've seen the Matrix. Of course, you've all seen the Matrix. Most of you have. You remember the scene with the red pill and the blue pill, right? Morpheus is giving Neo a choice. So, guys, your homework is to watch The Matrix, okay? Because it's really really relevant. I don't know how we would watch it together because it's virtual. Um, the class is virtual. I'll tell you what, if The Matrix is ever playing at one of the local theaters, like we have these little old-timey theaters here in Ottawa. There's the Mayfair in uh on Bank Street, and there's the Bytown Cinema in down in Lower Town. If they are ever screening The Matrix, um, we'll go as a sort of field trip. Um, yeah, OTV and Res houses. Yeah, that's a possibility. I mean, you guys can all get together yourselves and check it out if you haven't seen it. But the point is, this scene where, this is Morpheus bringing Neo out of the cave of ignorance, right? The Matrix is really like Plato's cave. And he wakes up and gets into the real world. This sort of thing has been appropriated by, those I think somebody in the chat called them right wing grifters, right? I think that's probably a good way to put it. So these guys take seriously the possibility that perhaps we're living in a simulation. Um, so I think that actually being able to think about these questions properly is important, because there are some pretty powerful and pretty influential people who are pretty bad at thinking about these problems, these questions. So I think it's good if you equip yourself to think about these things, even if they don't seem too relevant. Because again, our task here is to ask fundamental questions, and we also live in a world where there are people who, maybe aren't like the best people, um, uh, who are bad at thinking about these things. Um, so that's why we talk about this. Okay, now we're going to move on to part two. So I can skip this slide because it's all recap. Uh, oh yeah, before we continue, Pernille says, do we live in a post-truth world? I'm not sure, but I worry about it. I certainly worry about it. Um, it certainly seems that way, right? Because we have misinformation and disinformation all over the internet. Uh, there are deep fakes, and now there's AI generated video. Um, there there are people that are insulated from one another to such a degree that I think at least if you look at it politically, there are people on the right and the left and probably in the center who seem to live in completely different epistemic worlds, right? And that's a big problem. I mean, you saw what happened yesterday. Did you guys see the news about what happened yesterday? Yeah. Yeah. I heard chit chat about it on the way home, but I didn't know I was like, what's happening? Um and then yeah, I would say don't watch it. I also watched it. And I would not recommend it. Um and that's not just the only example, right? That's just the most recent example. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't know very much about Charlie Kirk. From what I do know, I probably would have vehemently disliked the man. But you can't just go killing people, right? Uh, yeah, like, yeah, his family, right? Like, I mean, and this was a young guy. Who knows? Maybe he would have changed his mind at some point about some of the things he believed. Yeah, they were there. It was horrible. Um, but it's not an isolated example, right? The January 6th. Yeah, Ryan, that's right. That's I think you hit the nail on the head. He was not a very good dude, but no one deserves that. Like, if they can do that to somebody you don't like, they can do it to you, right? That's why we all have rights. Yeah, the two Minnesota senators, right? Again, January 6th, the attack on Paul Pelosi, right? It's like people are living in these epistemic bubbles, like different worlds from one another. And that is really bad, right? That's not good. Um, um, yeah, as far as I know, the suspect is still at large. Yeah. So, I think that this sort of violence, whether it happens, whether it's somebody on one side of a political spectrum committing it against another, I mean, um, the debate bros like Charlie Kirk and Steven Crowder are super annoying and they have problematic views. But we do need to be able to talk about things in good faith. I don't know if that's what Charlie Kirk does. I don't think he did it in good faith, but we do need to actually be able to talk to each other in good faith, right? And that's something that seems to be disappearing, and I think leads to this in part. Maybe it's a contributing factor to this violence, and that's really not a good thing, right? I don't like to see that. Um, yeah, yeah. Like, where did the notion of agree to disagree go? Yeah, let's remove monetization features from X. That's another problem is that social media companies incentivize misinformation. That's another problem. So, but look, we could have like a whole class on this, right? I don't want to get um, too too wrapped up in it. I'll tell you what though, I am glad that you guys are following current events. Um, that's good. It's important to be an informed citizen of the world, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're right, Ryan. And I hope that changes. Okay, so Hyla has a question. Did skepticism think that we see the world as it really is using our senses to be considered knowledge? Um, no. Well, skepticism would at least say like it might be true that you might have this belief and it might be true, but it doesn't count as knowledge because you can't rule out alternative scenarios, right? Like a mad scientist has programmed your brain to perceive something, or your brain in the vat, and what you think is the real world. It's just electrical signals being fed into your brain, right? The skeptics do discuss the senses, but what Descartes wanted was his own argument, the strongest skeptical argument against the reliability of sense experience that he could. So he put his own argument together, and that was the dream argument. Yeah. Um, good question. This is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. So I I don't I don't want to answer very confidently. Um, I will say that social constructivism or constructionism is a part of like the postmodernist movement in philosophy. And you can characterize postmodernism as a sort of skepticism about what we could call meta narratives. So the sort of like stories about the stories that we tell about ourselves. Um, Really, I think on postmodernism, these are things that we construct. That doesn't mean that they're not real, right? Um, like money is a social construct, you know. So if somebody says, "Hey, such and such is just a social construct," ask them for all of their money, right? And then see if they actually believe what they're saying. So money's a social construct, right? Um, But I guess it's kind of somewhat related, but I'm not really comfortable saying much beyond that because I'm not really an expert on sociology or postmodern philosophy. Somebody else could probably give you a better answer than I could. Okay, we're going to talk about David Hume. But first, men, what's stopping you from dressing like this? So this is David Hume with his cool hat. And he was trained as I believe, a lawyer, and then went on to become a philosopher. Clapped. I don't know what that means. Yeah, Galen, I know what you mean. I'm tall and I have a hard time uh finding things that fit properly. I've been this is way off topic, but I try to look for things in tall sizes. Some stores have that. They'll have a large, but they'll also have a large tall. The large tall tends to fit better. Um, that's something I learned from my girlfriend because she knows she knows about that. Um, yeah, it does. I would say maybe this outfit goes harder than it needs to. How tall? Oh, wow. Oh, well, you must have a heck of a time, Basatu. Yeah, you're like 5 inches taller than I am. Well, but then they have special stores. Oh, well, still, if there are any very tall people, Uh, they do have special stores, but yeah, I'm like 6'2.5", so I'm in that weird like tall but not super tall area. So I'm too short for the big and tall store and too big for the regular store. Arm Street. Okay, cool. Nice. Well, maybe if I go to Arm Street, I can put myself together a nice David Hume outfit. I mean, it does look comfortable. Um, So, remember that Descartes was a rationalist, right? David Hume is an empiricist. So, he thinks that knowledge does come from sense experience. His most famous work is called A Treatise of Human Nature. Now, in it, Hume kind of talks about everything, everything related to the human being. Um, but he's primarily concerned with, I would say, metaphysics and epistemology. Um, this is at a time when, a book like this wouldn't have wouldn't have been thought of as like a textbook, but a book that educated, well-to-do people would have read at their leisure. You see people riding the bus today. You don't see many people reading A Treatise of Human Nature unless maybe they're a philosophy student. But back in the day, a lot of people would have read these books. Same with Descartes' Meditations. They would have been widely read. Um, yeah, well, it is like a bonnet, right? Like one of those things you wear to keep your hair nice when you go to bed, right? Maybe he's about to go to bed and, have some kind of dream that gets him started thinking about skepticism. Now, Hume has a different set of worries than Descartes does. Um, oh, well, that's a good question. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves too much, but Hume would say um, that we actually get those concepts from experience, right? Like, so I said earlier that a triangle is a three-sided polygon, and you can know that every triangle ever is a three-sided polygon without checking by like drawing triangles in every possible configuration. Sure, that's true, but um, you learn the concept of a triangle, like with sense experience. That's what Hume would say. Why has reading philosophy become less common? Good question. Good question. I'm not sure. I think people are still very interested in philosophy, but I don't know. I really don't have an answer to that. Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I have to think about that and get back to you. So, David Hume thinks that we can know lots of different things. Um, and we might even be right about them. But he also claims that if we are correct in our beliefs because we rely on some particular method, we had better have good reasons for using that method, right? Um, if we think we have true beliefs because we have a method of arriving at those beliefs which seems good, we better have good reasons for thinking it's a good method. And that is what Hume is concerned with, whether we have good reasons for holding the beliefs that we do. I think we would all agree that we should have good reasons for the things that we believe, right? Even though many of us probably believe all sorts of different things, right? We've probably got skeptics and believers in the class, right? We've got atheists, agnostics, religious folks, and we all believe different sets of things. And we probably disagree with one another on certain of those things. But we all should agree that to hold the beliefs that we do, we require good reasons, right? People are illiterate nowadays anyway. Well, I don't know, maybe that's a little uncharitable, but people do read less. Um, yeah. Yes, Arham, thank you. We need to go. Yeah, everybody be yeah, that's a good point. Let's be nice. No, these are good questions. I don't want to discourage you from asking them. Um, I don't know. I think uh, actually this might be a question for a sociologist. So if any of you are in a sociology class, maybe ask them. But it's probably maybe it's got to do with the way that these ideas are delivered. We've gone from long books to television and radio, or radio and television, to the internet, to social media, where now a lot of the content we consume on social media is very, very short, right? Only seconds, like on some TikToks, or like you're reading a tweet. Um, it's short. And it does, when you grow up with this, it does actually impact your attention span, right? So anyway, we want to have good reasons for having the beliefs that we do, and we want to have good reasons for using the methods that we use in order to arrive at those beliefs, right? And if we're asked, Hume says, to provide good reasons for why we use the methods at arriving at beliefs that we do, well, Hume's going to say we don't actually have any good reasons, and that's a problem, right? We're naturally inclined, he would say, to many of our beliefs. We're naturally inclined to endorse certain methods that we think are good at producing true beliefs. Um, and hey, a lot of the beliefs we arrive at via these methods are probably going to be true, but we're not rationally entitled to these beliefs. That was Hume's point. What that means is that we can't really take epistemic credit for those beliefs. What kind of method does Hume have in mind specifically? Induction. He's talking about induction. So, um, there's lots of well, there's a couple, not lots, but uh, a couple different sorts of induction. One is enumerative induction. So let's talk firstly about um, induction versus deduction. So what's the difference? Well, deductive arguments are the sort of arguments that Descartes would have been interested in. Deductive arguments are truth preserving, and deductive arguments go from general principles to reason about specific cases. Inductive inference is the opposite. Inductive inference goes from specific cases to general principles, and it's not necessarily truth preserving. So one kind of inductive inference is called enumerative induction, right? And that's all about whether you go out and you observe members of a certain category and you see if they have properties in common with one another, and then you say that, well, every member of that group must have this property as well. So maybe I'm here on the Carleton campus, as I am now, and I decide to go bird watching. And I decide that since the mascot of Carleton University is Rodney the Raven, I am going to go and try and find some ravens. And I'm going to try and avoid the crows because they look similar, but once you get a knack for distinguishing them, they're quite easy to tell apart. So I go and I find my ravens and I see, I don't know, 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 ravens, all of which are black. They all have black plumage. So I reason to myself, well, all of the ravens that I observed have black plumage. So all ravens everywhere must have black plumage. That's enumerative induction, right? What, Claire, what's that a reference to? Oh, oh, right, from the the Beverly Hillbillies. I thought you were talking about something to do with ravens. That took me a second. Yeah, um Jethro Clampett, yeah, every time the doorbell rings, there's somebody there, and he doesn't quite master the doorbell concept, but yeah, that's enumerative induction. And then, as I said earlier, there's also abduction, which is an inference to the best explanation, right? So I come downstairs in the morning and I discover that my house plant has been knocked over. And I remember hearing something down there in the middle of the night, some vaguely cat-like noises, but I was too sleepy to really appreciate what was going on. So I come downstairs and I see that the plant has been knocked over. And I think, well, what could have knocked it over? I suppose it's possible that a ghost knocked it over, or that I have little gremlins living in my apartment that come out to play at night and they knocked it over, or that some kind of alien being intervened in my apartment and knocked it over. Or maybe my cat was just playing around and got a little excited and knocked it over. That's probably the best explanation. So I would be using abduction if I came to that conclusion. So again, Hume says we're naturally inclined to a lot of beliefs, but we're not rationally entitled to those beliefs. It's, for example, natural for me to believe that when I leave my apartment in the morning and come here to teach, that when I get back home, all of my stuff will still be there. Not because I won't be robbed, but because I believe the objects in my apartment will continue to exist even if I don't observe them, right? It's rationally for me, it's natural for me to believe that, but I'm not rationally entitled to such a belief. Why? Well, here's what Hume says. Hume says, it seems evident that men are carried by natural instinct or prepossession to repose faith in their senses, and that without any reasoning, or even almost before the use of reason, we always suppose an external universe which depends not on our perception, but would exist though we and every sensible creature were absent or annihilated. Even the animal creations are governed by a like opinion, and preserve this belief of external objects in all their thoughts, designs, and actions. So Hume says, look, we're kind of like naturally inclined to believe in the existence of the external world. Even if we were all popped out of existence, we would still believe that the world would continue without us. Even animals seem to understand this, Hume is saying. Um, I'm watching over here a groundhog because we have so many of those groundhogs on the campus. And it's out and about out of its burrow right now. Now, when it goes back into its burrow, that groundhog, in some sort of groundhoggy sense, probably maintains a belief that the world outside of its burrow continues to exist. Again, in its own like groundhoggy sort of way, right? And Hume thinks that, yeah, this is natural. And we might even be justified about certain things, certain beliefs we have about past and present experience, for example. But what about when it comes to the future? Oh, so I explained this, um, the difference between induction and deduction. I explained that. Um, Deduction is truth preserving and it goes from general principles to reason about specific cases. And inductive inference is reasons from specific cases to try and derive general principles. Yeah, quantum physics might make things difficult, or it might not. It really depends on what interpretation of quantum physics you adopt. Okay, so Hume says that belief about the past is justified. Belief about the present is justified. So if I believe that yesterday I had pizza for supper, I'm probably rationally justified in that because I remember. Like, yeah, I got some pizza. I remember eating it. When it comes to my belief that I'm sitting here lecturing to you amongst the groundhogs, I'm good. I'm justified in that belief. But when it comes to the future, we seem to be doing something different. We seem to be relying on a constant conjunction between cause and effect, right? So what am I talking about here? A constant conjunction between cause and effect. We can schematize it like this. All observed A's have been followed by B's. An A is currently being observed, therefore B will follow. Can we try and make this more concrete with some examples? These are what we call variables, right? Like in mathematics, like in mathematics, how you have variables in mathematics, we want to turn them into constants. So all observed A's have been followed by B's. What are some examples? Well, maybe all observed nights have been followed by sunrises, and it's currently night, therefore a sunrise will follow. Now, what Hume is asking is whether believing in one and two entitles us to believe in the conclusion. And we can put a little deductive spin on this and see how this is supposed to work, right? Yeah, that's present experience though, Trevor. Yeah. But maybe every time I've been outside in the rain, um I've gotten wet. It is currently raining, so now I will get wet. Maybe that, right? Life and death, sure. All moms are followed by a child. Well, maybe. Um, what is classical conditioning? I'm not really sure what you're asking about. So anyway, let's continue. Again, there's a lot going on in the chat. I don't want to discourage the chat, but sometimes I just kind of have to keep on going, right? Why does believing one and two entitle us to believe in three? Yeah, I know that classical conditioning is a psychology term. I'm not really sure why it's being brought up. We're talking about induction, um, which is not exactly the same as classical conditioning. Okay, let's try and put a deductive spin on this, right? Um, Here's one that we're doing. This is called modus ponens, which is Latin for the way that affirms by affirming. And it always has the form if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. It always has that form. It's a deductively valid form of inference, which means if you use modus ponens and if all of your premises are true, you're guaranteed to arrive at a true conclusion, right? So here, if it rains a lot in the spring, the Ottawa experimental farm will have a good science corn crop. It rained a lot in the spring, so we can conclude that the Ottawa experimental farm has a good science corn crop. Now, these arguments, like I said before, are truth preserving, right? If the premises are true and you follow the form of the argument correctly, like you don't commit any logical fallacies, your conclusion is guaranteed to be true. And you're rationally justified in believing the conclusions of deductive arguments just by virtue of the form of the argument and on the truth of the premises. If you make a mistake and you commit a fallacy, right? If you don't use the wrong form, if you or no, if you use the wrong form of argument, um, or if some of your premises are false, then you're not justified in believing the conclusion. But all things being equal, if the premises are true and the form of the argument valid, you're good. You're good to go, right? Now, that's deduction. Is there a similar license for induction? Maybe. Let's see. What is it that entitles us to believe that this constant conjunction that I mentioned earlier in the past will occur in the future, right? What is it about my observation that every night is followed by a sunrise justifies my belief in the proposition the sun will rise tomorrow? How do I know? Am I justified in my belief am I rationally justified in my belief that the future will resemble the past is basically what is at issue here, right? Hume says that when we're using inductive reasoning, we're actually relying on an unstated principle. He calls it the uniformity principle, or rather, subsequent philosophers have taken to calling this the uniformity principle. This is how Hume formulated the principle. He says we're relying on this principle that says that instances, oh my goodness, the slide moved, that instances of which we have had no experience must resemble those of which we have had experience, and that the course of nature continues always uniformly the same. That's the university form, the uniformity principle. Um, so explaining this inference that uh, all observed A's have been followed by B's. An A is occurring right now, therefore B will follow. So, a proposition like B will always follow A. This all involves a sort of tacit reliance on this uniformity principle. Now, Hume isn't endorsing the uniformity principle. He's just saying that we're sort of unconsciously relying on it, right? Think about it. If I ask you, will the sun rise tomorrow? What do you say? Yes, probably. Yes, hopefully. Hope so, yes. But probably, right? Yeah. Yeah, we're not in Iceland. Maybe if we were in Iceland, right? Then sure, maybe it wouldn't rise every day in the winter. Maybe we'd have like an extended period of darkness, right? Because we're above the Arctic Circle. But all things being equal, right? Maybe we're not in Iceland. We're here. So, um, it should rise. Why? Well, that's what happened yesterday, right? If that's the reasoning that I'm undergoing, then what I'm doing is relying on this sort of uniformity principle unknowingly, right? So, let's move on. There are two ways, according to Hume, to justify a claim. Claims can be about the world, or they can be about definitions or concepts. And we use sense experience to try and justify the claims we make about the world, and we use reason to justify claims involving definitions and concepts, right? Like I say to you, Jones is a bachelor. You instantly know he's not married. Why? Well, because that's just definitionally true. So you're using reason when it comes to those things. When it comes to the world, you're using sense experience. Can either approach justify reliance on the uniformity principle? Well, to justify relying on the uniformity principle by reason, we'd have to show that it's a truth of reason, right? We'd have to show that it's analytically true, in the same way that all triangles have three sides is true. What we need to do is show that denying the uniformity principle is self-contradictory, right? Like if I said to you, all triangles have four sides, well, that's self-contradictory because the idea of having three sides is contained within the concept of triangle, right? Um, but here's the problem. The uniformity principle says that, nature is uniformly the same, the future will resemble the past, but the proposition the future will not resemble the past is not self-contradictory. You know, it's possible that the future would not resemble the past, and the world would be a very weird place. Like the sun doesn't rise tomorrow, that would be pretty weird. But it's not logically contradictory to say that the sun will not rise tomorrow. It's not logically contradictory to say that the future will not resemble the past. So it doesn't seem like we can justify reliance on the uniformity principle um, using reason, right? Well, could we use experience to justify it? we might reason our way through an argument like the following. We might say reliance on the uniformity principle in the past has led to true beliefs, and I am relying on the uniformity principle now. Therefore, my relying on the uniformity principle will lead to a true belief. What's the problem with doing that? I guess I kind of give it away on the slides, but let's hear from you. What's the problem? I need to know whether I can justify my reliance on the uniformity principle. In the past, it's worked, and I'm relying on it now, so I should rely on it in the future, right? Well, this would be circular, wouldn't it? Yeah. Yeah, you'd be trying to support yeah, that's what is in question. Exactly. I if I were to try and justify the uniformity principle inductively, I would be presuming the future will be like the past, but that's exactly what I'm trying to establish in the first place. So this is a sort of circular argument. We call this begging the question, by the way. You know, when you when you write your papers, you're going to want to watch out for this one. Um, oftentimes, especially I find in the news media or on television shows, this phrase is used incorrectly. So, you know, for example, trying to think of an example. Well, I mean, the recent bit, the news that we were talking about earlier, right? Maybe somewhere some news anchor is saying that, you know, so and so was shot, which begs the question: is public debate no longer safe in America? Well, it doesn't beg the question. No, it raises the question, but it doesn't beg the question. Begging the question is a technical term in philosophy, so you need to make sure that you're using it properly. And basically what it refers to is a type of circular argument where the thing that you set out to prove or establish, the thing you're trying to form a conclusion on, actually features as a sort of secret premise in your argument. We'll encounter other examples of begging the question as we make our way through the course. So, where are we? Um, Inductive inference is legitimized by something like UP, right? Something like the uniformity principle. But we can't justify our reliance on this principle by reason because because uh, because it's just not self-contradictory. And we also cannot justify or rather, you know, we can try to we find that denying it is not self-contradictory, right? Like not in the same way as saying triangles have a different number of sides than three is self-contradictory. And we can't rely on it via sense experience because that would mean we have to appeal to the uniformity principle, which is the same thing that we're trying to establish as reliable, right? Yeah. UP is always in question. Um, Now, we can't claim, therefore, that um, our inductive inferences are rationally justified. We can't claim to have good reasons for the beliefs we arrive at via inductive inference. Now, then again, it's natural, Hume would say, to arrive at beliefs this way. We're just not rationally justified in doing so. But is he right? Right? This is what 20th century philosopher Peter Strawson had to say. Peter Strawson was a philosopher who was at Oxford University in the United Kingdom during the 20th century. Um, Yeah, maybe it could be like, language is not a static thing, right? Language changes. The meaning of words and phrases changes over time. And it could be the case that maybe that we could say that, begging the question in such a context is correct. But in philosophy, it's still a technical term. So you still have to make sure you're using it properly in this context, right? But yeah, words change all the time. Like, I mean, it's a common like old person sort of joke about young people, like how um, bad means good, you know? Uh, and there's probably some other examples I could think of after a little bit more coffee, but yeah, maybe Preneel, maybe they do to be like to make more of an impression than raises the question. It's still technically incorrect. Um, so yeah. You've just got to watch out in your essays. Like if you want to use it with your friends, like, hey, this begs the question, like I'm not going to like pop out of somewhere and be like philosophy police freeze, you know. But if you're writing your essays, you need to use begging the question the right way, right? Okay, so here's what Strawson says about Hume. Strawson said, it is an analytic proposition, a proposition true by definition, whose denial is an implicit self-contradiction, that it is reasonable to have a degree of belief in a statement which is proportional to the strength of the evidence in its favor. And it is an analytic proposition that all other things being equal, the evidence for a generalization is strong in proportion as the number of favorable instances and the variety of circumstances in which they have been found is great. So to ask whether it is reasonable to place reliance on inductive procedures is like asking whether it is reasonable to proportion the degree of one's convictions to the strength of the evidence. Doing this is what being reasonable means in such a context. So Strawson is saying that here um, Hume is wrong, and induction is justified by reason. Doing induction is what it means to be reasonable, right? Here, I just have to my PC is dying here. I just have to make sure that I am on power saving mode for the last little bit of this lecture. Oh, why does it do that? It always clicks over to high performance. I don't want it to do that. Here, let's check how much battery life we have. Oh boy, we're getting low. 7 minutes. Oh boy, it's going to be close. Later, Strawson kind of changes his approach and he says, our inescapable natural commitment is to a general frame of belief and to a general style, the inductive of belief formation. And Hume would agree with that. Hume would say, yeah, yeah, dude, we're naturally inclined. We're naturally inclined to using inductive inference like this. Sure. But are we rationally justified in doing so? No, Hume would say. If we wanted to respond to Hume, what we should maybe do is try to show how induction plays the role that it does in belief formation or belief change. We'd have to show that it's fundamental. But even then, I mean, maybe Hume wouldn't be satisfied because, Hume isn't denying that we do this or that it's natural to do this. He just says we don't get the epistemic license from relying on the uniformity principle that we think we do. Levan says, if I'm following, we are naturally inclined to use inductive inference. How we can't rationally use the uniform. Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. You've got it. You've got it exactly right. It's natural. It makes sense. We're probably right when we use inductive inference in the right way. But can we be rationally justified in reliance on the uniformity principle? That nature is uniformly the same. No, Hume would say. Now, later on, Immanuel Kant is going to come along and he's going to fix all this. Okay. Don't worry. Don't worry about it. Or maybe do worry about it because then we'll have to read Kant. Um, Kant is a difficult philosopher to get through, but very, very interesting philosopher. Lots of cool stuff to say. So, Hume and Strawson actually agree. We don't really have any counter arguments against the skeptic. Um, and they both agree further that it's natural. But they disagree on whether it's reasonable, right? Hume says reason doesn't guarantee the efficacy of induction. That is the effectiveness of induction. Strawson says, sure, it does. This is what, by doing induction, that's one of the ways that we are reasonable, right? Um, but you also got to keep in mind that induction takes place within the context of other beliefs. And maybe those other beliefs, like maybe the epistemic context in which you're practicing induction might lend some license to certain beliefs and prohibit others. Again, think about abduction, right? Given my epistemic context, I know I have a cat. I don't know that there are aliens watching my apartment. It's probably better for me to conclude that the cat knocked over my houseplant, not that aliens did it with some kind of tractor beam, right? Um, so I don't know. I wanted to have a little bit of discussion, but I am running out of batteries, and we are actually finished. We finished early today. Isn't that cool? Even with some interesting discussion in the chat. That's great. Um, so this has all been about whether knowledge is possible, right? That's the concern of the skeptic. Is knowledge possible? We haven't really talked very much about what knowledge is. And that is what we will be doing next week. So for next week, you want to read chapter 2 of our textbook, Knowledge. And we're going to learn all about what knowledge is.